Playing makes us human. All humans play. Some human play is so alive that just to witness it happening is enlivening. Often that play involves structured, mimetic role play in real time and space, what we now call drama. The sparsely surviving records from before the year 1485 in England bear witness to ubiquitous playing, Robin Hood folk games, for instance, but it's usually difficult to determine from the records whether or not a given medieval English play was dramatic and whether or not it was scripted. The medieval English considered all types of play and game generically continuous, but never called any of it drama or theater, let alone high art, so few play texts were preserved with much care. In the fall of 2020, we read most of the texts that did survive. The maimed extant half of The Pride of Life, a morality play whose mirthful allegory for mortality, health, and income inequality resonates as much today as during the Black Death, was itself mortal, destroyed in 1922. Fabliaux, like the campily misogynist anti-clerical Dame Seereth, which typifies how playtexts might be inscribed as literary poems or vice versa, with unspoken apparatus left off or inserted, often in Latin after the fact, were less likely to survive visibly as plays than lay plays on sacred material, whose grassroots doxic Catholicism often took liberties that now feel unorthodox, like the York Joseph's Troubles, which reimagines Joseph as a Fabliaux stock character. If some of the overabundant jokes, songs, and implied gags in Mankind disgust modern readers, if we can resist our tendency to minimize, erase, or move them off stage, then they can help us see ways that our modernity may repress us, and mercifully they can loosen us up with laughter, because in play the reverent and irreverent shit need not be opposed. In liturgical drama performed by clergy as part of religious ritual, dramatic role-playing is at the core of the medieval sacred, enacted with grand interactivity among the nuns of Barking, with an embodied aliveness that, like the bodily humor of Lydgate's court disguisings, is very difficult to grasp unless you try to enact it using your own body in real visible space. Pre-theatrical plays, if read without real bodies moving through space, fall flat. They were not flat. Perhaps it is our readerly perception of play that has been flattened. Perhaps in reading what remains of medieval plays we can begin to change that. When the conspicuously learned play of wisdom offers its black and white take on psychomachic allegory, then it lays out a typically contemplative diagram of consciousness using real bodies.
This is English 330-8, Wisdom Part 1. You've already gotten to know two of the plays in the macro manuscript. The Castle of Perseverance and Mankind. They are both morality plays, but are very different from each other, and were likely composed in different periods, or at least different generations. The third morality play in the manuscript, Wisdom, seems to have been composed again under quite different circumstances from both of the other plays. That is, the text that you're about to witness, or that you're about to read, is quite different from the other two. I leave it to you to begin to notice those differences. But what is a morality play? Now that we're about to look at our third morality play, a working definition seems to be in order. I like to use a simple definition for a morality play, a psychomachic allegory. A dramatized psychomachic allegory. I'm assuming that in a 300 level English class, you already know what an allegory is, but I'll give here M.H. Abrams' definition briefly. Quoting him, an allegory is a narrative, whether in prose or verse, in which the agents and actions, and sometimes the setting as well, are contrived by the author to make coherent sense on the literal or primary level of signification, and at the same time to communicate a second correlated order of signification for the duration of a distinct episode in a work or for the entire work. So in Mankind, for instance, at the literal level, you have a preacher who takes a farmer as a student. He teaches the farmer how to live well and avoid sin by focusing on his work. The farmer gets distracted by a bunch of schmucks, and they eventually shit on him, at which point, shamed, he asks for and receives mercy from his teacher, preacher. At the second level of signification, the teacher is mercy, personified. The farmer is every human, and the schmucks are various vices. If you want more examples and types of allegory or allegorical constructions, you can pause on this slide and view it on full screen so you can see the smaller print. I give examples from children's books, from Lost, if you watched that show. But for now, I'll move on to psychomachic. By psychomachic, I mean a battle of the mind, or a battle for the soul. It's a term used by the 5th century Latin poet Prudentius as the title of his poem about a battle between vices and virtues. The characters in a psychomachia, dramatized or not, personify and allegorize the various conflicting forces involved in every person's attempt to live a better life. The conflict between those forces, which pull the person, the every person, toward or away from the better life, is the conflict that drives the drama. The characters can thus be personifications of concepts, personal tendencies, internal tendencies, emotions, external forces, everyday practices. And so, in a psychomachic allegory, having some trouble with slides today, in a psychomachic allegory, you might thus meet characters who are the embodiment of joy, sadness, disgust, anger, or fear, as in the Pixar movie Inside Out, which certainly qualifies as a psychomachic allegory. A psychomachic allegory can be a film, can be a novel, can be whatever, but if it's a play, then we call it a morality play. That's what a morality play is. Those of you who have seen Pixar's Inside Out might have registered in that movie how closely it hews to recognized and very learned writing about child psychology. Indeed, it's clearly influenced by child psychology writing. Wisdom, too, hews very closely to learned sources. It draws on and participates in what we call the contemplative tradition, in which very learned and very literate believers, lay and clergy, Latin and vernacular, practice their religion by working out and working through and writing out their deep, deep theological thinking combined with emotion and feeling. And they often use diagrammatic, like diagram or visual metaphors, for how their readers might follow the same thought process. Compare that to Mankind, right? So Mankind and Wisdom, same manuscript, roughly at the same time. And here I'm disagreeing a bit with Eleanor Johnson, who is an expert on the contemplative tradition and the relation to morality plays. Compared to Mankind, right? Mankind does make reference in passing ways to learned contemplative traditions, but its references never stay with the same reference for more than a quick 1 or 2 line quote, and it just as often mocks the Latinness or the learnedness of sources like that, even in Mercy's speeches. Whole swaths of wisdom, in contrast, whole scenes, whole dialogues, and indeed the diagrammatic underlying structure of the morality of wisdom are drawn from other texts, both Latin and English, that are generally part of that contemplative tradition. I'm not going to require you to read our edition's Appendix 1 of the sources of wisdom, which is among the rich material that David Klausner has appended to our team's edition. But I do require you to look at it and skim it. So go to that Appendix 1 sources. It's linked in the team's table of contents that is shared through the syllabus or at the end of the wisdom text as here, just to get a sense of its sheer volume. You can also compare it to the sources provided for The Pride of Life. It's in that same appendix because the two plays are edited together here. You'll see Pride gets 2 sources, both of which correspond closely to the same short part of the bishop's speech in The Pride of Life. You can see that the bishop's speech, at least that part of it, is drawn from these sources. And those 2 sources and their quotations fit pretty much onto the equivalent of 1 printed page in the printed edition. The sources for wisdom that Klausner compiles cover 16 pages in that same printed edition. All of those long passages that Klausner provides in Latin and English are drawn on heavily for a lot of the dialogue and structure of Wisdom. It's a very learned play. A few of them are nearly verbatim in places. Wisdom's final monologue, his final big monologue in the play of Wisdom, is about the 9 things you can do right, and it is lifted pretty closely from the final entry in Klausner's appendix. And that's not even counting the source material in the Vulgate Bible, which Klausner leaves out. He says he leaves it out. When I say the Vulgate Bible, remember, I'm saying the medieval Latin Bible, which is what the DRBO translates closely. Remember, it's only the Latin one that medieval playmakers had access to, but I offer you the DRBO as the closest thing you can get to it without mastering Latin. And the wisdom playmakers draw on that closely too. If you're interested in the biblical sources for wisdom, I'd recommend, if you're interested, taking a look at the short and erotically rich book of Canticles, also known as the Song of Solomon. I'm not requiring you to read any of those source texts, but I want you to know they're there. and I invite you to read them. I expect that loose, casual invitation will create in our class potentially a diverse range of levels of familiarity with the sources, or with the tradition that contains those sources. That range will likely, I think, mimic the range of familiarity among the spectators and players of Wisdom that would have been present in the 15th century. A few of the stage directions in Wisdom definitely require children to be present, both present in the play among the players and present among the spectators, including my favorite stage direction ever in a work of medieval drama at line 550 plus SD. I'll let you get there. What will help you understand Wisdom as you read is what I'm going to offer you for the remainder of this lecture: a crash course in the diagrammatic approach to better living. Remember, psychomachia is a struggle toward better living, allegorized. A crash course in the diagrammatic approach to better living that is typical of contemplative medieval writing, as Wisdom presents it. So here goes. This stuff draws heavily on the work of 14th century mystic and clergyman Walter Hilton, as well as on an anonymous work misattributed to St. Bernard. You'll see those in items B through D in the appendix. We start with the soul. Think about the Corpus Christi-oriented worship we talked about in prior lectures, right? Every soul, Latin anima, every soul has Jesus inside it, at once as the highest part of the soul and as a divine presence in it, right? So Jesus is in every soul, both because every soul kind of has part of Jesus as part of it, but also because Jesus is present as an external force affecting every soul. Again, anima, which is the name of one of your main characters, is the Latin for soul. However, in modern use, the term soul, as we use it, usually front loads potentially divisive religious connotations. Do you believe in the soul? Blah, 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 blah. If you look up soul in the MED, you'll find a definition with far broader usage. I quote here: the spiritual and rational element in man, the Christian soul, understood to animate and control the body, as in contrast or combination with the body. It can mean the mind. It can mean the intellect, as we say it. It can also mean the imagination, the seat of emotions, feelings, etc. It can be will, purpose, desire. It can be the animating principle of beast or man. It is animate existence, the life of beast or man, a person, an individual, or even the disembodied spirit of a dead person, as in All Souls Day. You'll also find, with the query sign at the MED here, the spongy lining of the frame of a goose. I hope by now you have used the MED enough to know that you have to use dictionaries with care and common sense, and so you need to eliminate the rare and queried goose definition from our discussion here of the idea of soul. But it's the first definition, I'd argue, with the first set of definitions, that it's roughly the same as what we mean now when we say self, or when we say consciousness in present usage. Indeed, the OED entry for self as it is used after 1641 aligns very closely with the MED usage that I just cited. And so, I prefer to translate anima and soul in this play as self, or as consciousness. I think it actually makes a lot more sense for a modern reader. It is the play Wisdom, meanwhile, that translates the presence of Jesus in all of ourselves as the wisdom in and of every soul. So here we have a sort of more secularly understandable relation. There's the self, and in every self and of every self is wisdom. If you're not Christian, but you are looking for the better life, like the rest of us, it helps to think of wisdom as the highest part of yourself. The highest part of your consciousness is your wisdom. It is the part of you and the thing in you that is connected with something greater than you. The part of you that's connected to something timeless, perhaps the accumulated knowledge of human culture and philosophy and art that we can all connect to when we're our best selves, in you and of you. Now, that's not me trying to sanitize the Christianity of this play. Those are the terms through which the play presents its Christianity. In one of their many amorous exchanges between Wisdom and anima, Wisdom says, quote, "The length of the years in my right side be, and in my left side riches, joy, and prosperity." You see, in this play, the relationship between the self and timeless wisdom is allegorized as an erotic relationship. The self and the wisdom are lovers, amiable to be held and kissed. This is at line 43 and 44. Amiable to be held and kissed. And then later on, I love my lovers without end, that have their love steadfast in me. The self here is a maiden, and timeless wisdom is her man. Or are they? I challenge you in these opening scenes to actually follow the pronouns and other markers of gender who we're calling son, who we're calling women, who we're calling wives. See what you think about which one is which, or if either is anyone. Anyway, wisdom tells the self about herself. It is wisdom that helps the self understand what she is. Get it? And so at lines 135 through 160, pictured here, wisdom gives an especially diagrammatic depiction of the soul or self or consciousness. I'm not going to read this here. You're going to read this in a moment. But instead, I'm going to break it down visually. So what wisdom says here, what wisdom says about the soul, or rather what wisdom says about the self or of consciousness, which will make, I think, reasonable sense to you once we get past the complexity of it, is in those lines. So I'm just taking those lines and putting them in a visual form here. So what he says is roughly this. The soul, the self, has two parts. The bottom half, the nether part of the soul, is feeling, is sensuality. Sensuality in the sense of knowing things by means of information gained through your senses, which is why this nether part of the soul is served by the five outward wits, or the five senses we call them: taste, touch, sight, hearing, and smell. The upper part of the soul is reason. And on top of that is the place where wisdom resides. This is how wisdom describes it. As wisdom puts it, the bottom half must be controlled and kept in check by the top half in an orderly way, or else the bottom half will start to become corrupted. Walter Hilton, one of the sources that this is being drawn from, right, says that this lower half of consciousness, the part that takes in sensory information, is inherently female. That's why it must be ruled in an orderly way by the male upper reasoning part. You think of that moment in Mankind where mankind compares the sorry state of his soul to a household in which the woman is running things, and that's why things are out of order. But you'll notice that wisdom, while it draws really directly on Walter Hilton's model, excludes conspicuously that part about how the upper half's ordering of the lower half mimics a well-run heteropatriarchal household. So that's for you to think about. Again, you notice I'm hinting about some of the gender going on in wisdom in particular, as opposed to its sources, on which more in the lecture that will follow. Anyway, all of this diagramming I'm doing, again, is based only on what you can find in the dialogue of wisdom. It's actually laid out pretty clearly and slowly in the dialogue, actually, but without the benefit of a live performance showing you these things, readers will find it very hard to visualize it on the first go. So here I am prepping you visually. Okay, as the place first scene progresses, wisdom will further divide the upper half of the self, here we go, into two halves. Now we've separated out the top part of the soul, or of the self, into two parts: the upper part, the over part, and the nether part, the lower part. The reasoning half of the self, of consciousness, thus has two halves. The higher part is free will. And in a healthy consciousness, that's the part which is or should be closest to wisdom. Remember, wisdom is the highest part that is both in the soul, but also part of something greater that has set itself into the soul, something timeless, something beyond you. The rest is you. This is your consciousness. So this upper part of the soul, or of the self, is reason. The lower part of the upper part is divisible into three parts: mind, understanding, and will. In medieval usage and in this play, it's best, I think, to think of mind as the part of your consciousness that involves knowledge. It's the part responsible for thinking, imagining, and remembering what you learn. And of course, what you learn can only come to you through your senses, through the lower half, right? You take in information through your senses. It comes up through what you feel and sense into your mind. The data that comes in at the bottom gets stored in your mind, or rather, the data that your mind registers as legitimate and true gets stored in your mind. So if the mind is sort of the hard drive where the data is stored, and if that's true, then understanding is the processor. I like using a computer metaphor here. though I don't know much about computers. Right? So the mind is a hard drive, the storage, and understanding is the processor. It processes, takes in, and experiences the knowledge that has been stored through experiencing the knowledge. And that is also a sense, it's not quite sensory, but like, what do you make of this? It's like your understanding of it, the way you take knowledge into your consciousness. Do you feel good about that? Do you feel bad about that? What do you think about that? That's the questions you ask of the understanding. So it's the data comes in, stored in the mind, and then you process it by thinking through it with your understanding. And then if understanding is the processor and mind is the hard drive, then will becomes the user interface. It uses the data that has been processed to determine what the self wants, strives for, or intends to do. Thus, all three, mind, will, and understanding, are fed information from the senses via the sensual half of the soul, the sensory half of the soul, maybe we should say. And together they process that stored information into decisions, which feed into the higher part of the soul, the higher part of the higher part of the soul, free will, which must then make its choices, hopefully also under the influence of the timeless wisdom that is in all of us. Notice, too, that the processing of general sensory information into will and then into free will is a kind of filtration system, right? Particularly via understanding, during which the bad or any bad or false or misleading or evil sensory input, the black arrows here, might get separated out and rejected, right? So mind too acts as a kind of filter by determining which input to keep and which to discard. And then understanding acts as a filter because understanding is how you think through the things you have learned and stored in your mind. And you think through them and decide, how do you feel about them? Do you feel good about that? Do you feel bad about that? You'll note, too, that the play of wisdom is here assigning colors, and these are the colors from wisdom, assigning colors to the quality of the material that your senses take in. Black for the bad, white for the good, with anima, the soul, always wearing both, even at the end when she is redeemed. She comes back in what she wore at the beginning. In present-day discourse, it's hard not to register this black hat, white hat, attachment of value judgments to black and white as racial or racialized terms, on which more in a moment. But before we get there, what happens when something goes wrong with the system that is presented in wisdom, when this filtration system is corrupted? In wisdom, you have a character named Lucifer, who also, like Jesus, may be present in each of us or near each of us, who catalyzes the failure of the system with relative ease. You'll notice here that the color of the arrows I've chosen here are red, green, and blue. It's actually only what happens to mind that is actually, everything that happens to mind is colored red, not black, interestingly. And then the other two are in other liveries. The suggestion is that they're in other colors too, I think. So I've taken a guess at what those might be. You'll see. Anyway, to corrupt mind, right? The hard drive where thinking, imagining, and remembering is done, you remember? Right? Lucifer introduces suggestion. Right? The suggestion of something. Let me just suggest this to you. Right? To corrupt understanding, the processor where data is taken in and made sense of through experiential knowing, Lucifer introduces pleasure, or delight as they put it. That is, an enjoyment of the bad suggestion. Remember, understanding asks, well, how do you feel about that? But of course, if you start delighting in the bad suggestion, then something has gone wrong. From there, naturally, Lucifer is well placed to manufacture consent, which is how to corrupt will. Indeed, with mind and understanding corrupted, will being fed corrupted data almost has no choice but to turn to and to consent to doing evil things. Corrupted, mind becomes maintenance, understanding becomes perjury, and will becomes lechery. Those are the terms that the wisdom playmakers use. I prefer to translate those medieval terms as collusion, corruption, and perversion. Right? So the corrupted mind becomes collusion. The corrupted understanding becomes corruption. That's sort of redundant, isn't it? And the corrupted will becomes perversion. What happens from there is much less dependent on the source texts, for the most part, and more about how the wisdom playmakers play through this very learned system for consciousness that they had built. Eventually, spoiler alert, it will be reflection, awareness, and contrition. That is, the feeling sorry for what has gone wrong. That fixed the system, that recalibrated into how it should work back when various data comes in through the senses, and then they are processed and filtered so that only the good stuff starts to influence your choices. But I'll let you get to reading. The artistry of wisdom, in short, is not so much in the rich conceptual and theological apparatus, the diagrammatic apparatus that it creates for how to understand the consciousness. Most of that is borrowed, which testifies to its creators' education and knowledge, but not so much their creativity, I guess. What is artful about wisdom, I think, is how it stitches those pieces together into something new. And I'm saying stitches together as a light way of getting you to notice how many metaphors here are bound up with clothing. Costume is a big deal in this play, and I'll talk to you more about that in my lecture after you read. So in how it stitches those pieces together into something new, and how it, by being a play, creates the necessity of an unpredictable and multivocal way of opening up what would otherwise be a tidy little diagram of how, through a psychomagic allegory, to live a better life. Blackness and whiteness are major motifs in this play. Those terms are also deployed in the overtly racist discourse that survives in various texts from across pre-modern Europe, especially those that are related to trade, exploration, and the Crusades. Though it is only in the 16th century that colonialism and systematized slavery make possible the conceptualization of the idea of whiteness and white supremacy and race as we now know it. The playmakers of wisdom, writing in a period long before, a blessed period long before England enters into global trade or exploration, let alone colonization, those playmakers are extremely unlikely to have associated their black-white dichotomy with the question of European or non-European genetic descent, broadly imagined, as we might discuss it today. However, the question of race and of skin tone is on the table related to wisdom's black-white imagery. You'll notice when you read at line 164 plus SD really early in the play, when the five senses enter. The five senses are five maidens who dance and sing but never speak. That makes sense. The senses don't speak, they just take in. These maidens sing a Latin verse from Canticles, from that book of the Bible I mentioned, also known as the Song of Solomon, in which the first line goes, "I am black but beautiful." In that verse from Canticles, the blackness of the lover's skin is as dark as the tents of cedar or the curtains of Solomon. I'll get you to remember now where the texts of the Judeo-Christian Bible come from geographically. Anima adds the next verse when she talks about what we've just heard. She explains with the next verse that the darkness of the lover's skin in this case comes from being out in the sun all day. The next verse in Canticles, if you go to it, explains that being out in the sun all day is about work. It comes from having worked all day out in the vineyards. The distinction between light and dark skin tone here is, I think, one of class. That is, the contemplative, undarkened life, the person who is not outside working, is one in which manual labor and interaction with the world would be rejected in favor of study or meditation on godly things, which, unless you joined the clergy, which you can do, only a certain class of people then and now can reject work in that way. In Mankind, you remember that the everyman character is a farmer, is a laborer. In Wisdom, we do also get a reveal allusively of what the occupation of our everyman is. It gets hinted at once the corruption occurs, and it is definitely a less outdoor job. Figuring out what it is that the imagined everyman, the owner of the soul in Wisdom, does will help you understand the amazing applicability of this play to present-day politics. However, in the end, as far as blackness goes, blackness here and in the Bible is beautiful. In the Bible and in the Wisdom Playmakers' quoting of the Bible. The blackness in the soul is retained at the end. And if you read Wisdom as I do, you'll see that it does not recommend a life spent entirely in contemplation and a removal from the world, even though the suggestion that Lucifer initially makes to initiate corruption is an argument against contemplation and isolation in favor of the mixed life of entering the world. But I leave those points of interpretation up to you. Get to reading. Then when you're done reading Wisdom, come back for lecture number 9. Thanks.